we have a very special guest joining us, Brad Brooks-Rubin. Brad is the Strategic Advisor and North America Engagement Lead at the Responsible Jewelry Council, the world's leading standard-setting organization for the jewelry and watch industry. Brad also serves as Senior Advisor at The Sentry, an investigative and policy team that follows the dirty money connected to African war criminals and transnational war profiteers, and seeks to shut those benefiting from violence out of the international financial system. Brad previously served as Policy Director and Managing Director of The Sentry, and prior, Brad held roles at the Gemological Institute of America, the U.S. Departments of State and Treasury, and law firms. Thanks again for joining us on The Rocks. If you like what you hear and want to catch past conversations, please make sure to subscribe. Let's dive in. Well, Brad, thanks so much for joining me on The Rocks today. It's great to have you on, calling in from D.C.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
And I'm excited to have somebody on the podcast who actually does know about the jewelry industry, because as a geologist, I get asked to evaluate people's gemstones all the time to make sure their engagement ring is not fake. Well, I can divert all those people to you, right?
Sounds like as being a lawyer, when everybody, even though I've worked on sanctions and international law, I get the question like, can you draft up my will or something like that? So yeah, I can help you out on this one for sure. I can't draft your will though. So
yeah, but how did you, with a law background, how did you end up getting into this space where you're dealing with conflict diamonds and gemstones and responsible sourcing?
Totally by accident. And I remember saying to my wife a few years ago when I was being recruited to work at the Sentry, like I've completely just fumbled in and made up this career, mostly just by following what I found to be a little bit of luck and a little bit of just following what I found to be interesting. I mean, I'm a lawyer, worked at a law firm for 6 years. I had mostly focused, in my personal life on sort of the Middle East, what I studied in college. And I showed up, I got a job at the Treasury Department's Chief Counsel's Office for Foreign Assets Control, essentially the legal team that advises OFAC on sanctions issues. Legal team is divided by country as opposed to function. And so I showed up and said, I'm really, I've worked a lot in the Middle East. And when I was at a law firm, I was advising clients on Iran sanctions and things like that. So I'm ready to dive in. And classic US government form, they were like, great, you're going to work on Africa. I didn't know anything really much about Africa at all. I had, bumbled around in French. That was about it. And, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, really. So I was basically assigned to work and kind of be the lawyer advising the different parts of OFAC and then ultimately the State Department and elsewhere on a range of sub-Saharan African sanctions programs, which was Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and all of those sanctions programs had an element of natural resources connected to them, right? All of them were focused in one way or another in trying to, designate bad guys or stop business with bad guys. And in most cases, those bad guys were dealing with natural resources. And the other part of it was that the Treasury Department had a small, when conflict diamonds had emerged, the world agreed on something called the Kimberley process, which maybe we can talk more about. But the Treasury Department had a small piece of implementing the Kimberley process. And so that also ended up on my plate. And this was 2006, 2007. And by then, the world had sort of moved on from the issue. And so nobody at Treasury was paying attention. And so I decided to go to some of the interagency meetings, which wasn't really my job as a lawyer. I was really for the policy people. But I started going and I found the issue super interesting and was hoping to find a way to work more on development and policy than law. And so basically my predecessor at State at one point said, we're having trouble finding a foreign service officer to do this job. Would you have any interest in coming over from Treasury? At the time, my wife worked at the State Department. My kids were in the Diplo-Tots, the State Department daycare. And so I thought, in addition to being an interesting issue, like my whole family would be in one place. From there, I've not really looked back and been focused in one way or another on the issues ever since.
No, I find that so fascinating and so gratifying to hear, because having started my mining career at the Pentagon, right? I mean, running an exploration program in Afghanistan, it was very rare that you came across policy folks or interagency folks that understood the natural resource sector. And it is so fundamental to a lot of stability issues, corruption issues, as well as all the positive and great things, right? But it's a fundamental industry to really understand if you're going to work in particular in emerging and frontier markets, right?
Yeah. Shortly after I got there, the sort of predecessor bill to Dodd-Frank was introduced around conflict minerals, and a range of other initiatives were really taking off around the mining sector. And I just sort of found myself getting invited to all these things. And so I started joking that my title was not special advisor for conflict diamonds, but special advisor for people fighting over rocks. And it was sort of one of those things. I would get invited to all these meetings, and they would sort of look at me and say, well, what do you have to offer in terms of policy advice? And I would sit there thinking, like, I don't have what are you asking me for? Like, I'm a lawyer who fumbled into this job because my kids were at the daycare at the State Department. And don't we have people that know this stuff? And it was sort of really surprising often that, no, actually, we don't have anybody who follows this. And especially at state, where people are rotating every couple of years, right? You'd have somebody with an expertise, and then I'd look for that person. Who is it that knows about mining in this place? Well, that person's now they're now in Canada, or they're now in, wherever. And so after a while, I became the guy that knew something about this stuff. And at some point decided I should probably start to learn something. So I knew, but I wouldn't pretend to be, I certainly don't have the level of certainly scientific knowledge, but, got to work a lot with people at the Geological Survey and other places to do what I could. But yeah, it's really been a fascinating area to work in. And I've been really, grateful for the chance. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, one of the reasons I told you I wanted to talk today was because I see so many lessons that have been learned, or at least we are collectively as an industry trying to implement around gemstones, right? Gemstones and other conflict minerals, right? Tin, tantalum, tungsten, gold. There have been efforts specifically tied to certain regions to kind of address issues. And in my opinion, while they may not have all been 100% effective, there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from what we've tried to implement in those spaces across our industry, because we're heading into a space where the world is going to need such a huge amount of minerals, and in particular, all the sexy minerals that people are all excited about right now, right? For electric vehicles and solar and wind, and just like copper, right? To like plug everything in and move the electricity around the globe. But, we've got to make sure that we do it the right way. And with your experience in particular, how do we make sure, or what lessons can we learn in terms of making sure that terrorist threat financing, conflict funding is not an issue? And, a lot of the countries I've worked in, you see it up close and personal. That's how a lot of the bad guys are making money.
The big answer is just like people have to be willing to ask hard questions and deal with uncomfortable answers, right? I think too often no matter what country you're talking about, no matter what sector you're talking about, like stuff isn't always in good shape, right? There are, whether it's environmental issues or how the local community has been treated, or corruption and threat finance, or, the way workers' conditions exist in the mine, like all of these things, there are standards. Happily, there are standards for all of them. And I think we as an international community have figured out that we need to address these issues. I think the hard thing is translating what's on paper and good intentions into reality, and making hard decisions of like, hey, we're not going to do business here, or we are going to report this red flag to a law enforcement agency, right? And too often still, I see a lot of companies and talk to a lot of companies who, we weren't sure about that, so we walked away. And it's sort of like, well, did you do something about it? What was your follow-up? No, we just walked the other way. And that's how things don't change. So I think we have a lot of the right tools. It's just how do we balance the real, as you said, like there's the drive for all these new minerals and to catch up, and for good reason, right? The green economy needs minerals, and our security needs minerals. But so how do you balance with like, hey, we need this stuff, with hey, we got to make sure people don't get hurt and robbed along the way.
Yeah. And I think so much of it, from my perspective, is lack of like a common language also. As with any industry, you've got groups within the industry, some companies that are really trying to do the right thing and are doing really good work, others that are trying to just kind of get by the skin of their teeth, and others that are up to nefarious acts. And oftentimes I think a lack of scientific and operational literacy on the part of, of regulators and of stakeholders even, right? Profits or groups that are trying to do advocacy, you can kind of talk past each other. And that makes it really hard to know the good guys from the bad guys if you don't really understand the technical and business aspects of the way the mining industry works.
I could not agree with that more. And at the moment, I have a job at the Century and a nonprofit, which has worked for years around East and Central Africa and done a lot of work around the mining sector. And I also work at the Responsible Jewelry Council. And in the past, I've worked in the government. So in some ways, I've been my own multi-stakeholder initiative, right? I've sort of looked at these issues and I see that lack of trust and lack of knowledge a lot, right? And one of the reasons I was interested to be able to work at RJC and the Century at the same time is to hopefully be able to translate those perspectives. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I've been around the diamond and jewelry industry now for 12, 14 years. I've been to a lot of mines. I've been to a lot of manufacturing sites. I understand the sector reasonably well. There are a few nonprofits still that focus on the jewelry sector and understand it well, but for the most part, reports that are written by journalists and by NGOs don't really understand how the sector works. They don't really have an appreciation for the challenges and the fact that there are real difficult issues that companies need to wrestle with. And I think a lot of NGOs and media outlets start from the perspective of we just want this industry to go away. And that's certainly not where I come from. And at the same time, I think what I try to do with the industry is to get across the idea that, hey, NGOs and regulators and media who cover this also know what they're talking about, right? It isn't just, they're not all out to just paint everybody as bad in the industry. There are plenty in these spaces who respect the sector, who respect what the sector can bring, who understand that it's really a ticket for development in a lot of places, but we have to be willing to be honest about what's actually happening and do warts and all reporting and call out the bad stuff and say, let's roll up our sleeves and work together to make real change.
I certainly see a change in the last, I would say, 2 years in the industry with the increasing focus on ESG metrics, right? Environmental, social, and governance metrics and reporting on that industry-wide and kind of even folks within the industry saying we need a consistent standard, right? That everyone's kind of held accountable to, while also recognizing that we've got to meet companies and groups where they are, right? And I mean, you and I both know there are lots of places in the world where right looks very different than it does in DC or South Florida, right? And I think that's the other part that sometimes is missed is the subtleties of operating globally can sometimes add challenges that take a little bit longer to work through.
For sure. I think that's really where hopefully there can be more over time, more of a meeting of the minds and a recognition that, we do, whether it's Afghanistan or DRC or, Venezuela, places that are really struggling, natural resources can be an important tool of development, but that getting on the right track does take time. NGOs, regulators, the media need to set, as you said, reasonable expectations, recognize that things are going to take time, not shift the goalposts around. And I think at the same time, for me, what's the struggle on the flip side has been, I think over the last 10, 20 years, industry has been faced with myriad standards, right? There's a standard for how you deal with private security. There's a standard for revenue transparency. There's a standard for how you deal with mercury in the gold sector. I mean, you name it, there's a standard for it. And that's a lot. That's a lot for a company to try to take on, to have the right compliance folks, to ensure that you're getting audited properly. It's a lot when you're also trying to do business and make money and actually get something out of the ground safely and to market. To me, I think the issue is that what I would like to see is more companies that are willing to say hey, we're trying, we are doing this, but it's not perfect. We didn't just sign up to this thing last week and now we've fully implemented and everything's fine. When industry is willing to say here's where we could actually use some help. How do we do this right? Or we're trying and we made some mistakes here and we're going to keep working at it and we would benefit from continued dialogue. I think the more these sides kind of keep each other at bay, the more challenging it is. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, the world needs these minerals, and the more we can encourage the trade to be developing those minerals properly and selling to the right folks and ensuring that the revenue gets back to the people, then we have a real chance to really transform things.
Yeah, and I think that's where I always come back to how valuable data and technology can be, right? In making things more transparent, but also more accessible I was just chatting with another podcast guest her in Florence, and she works with Indigenous populations in Australia, right, and runs the Indigenous Women in Natural Resources for Australia. And I was talking to her about how, like, the data that we have at Prospector, our app, how would that empower people just to have on their phone, right, information on any of the companies that are operating in their country and what their disclosures actually mean, right? What are they saying they're going to be doing in the next 12 months? Have they followed through on what they've said for the last 10 years, right? There's a lot that having data accessible can help in terms of maybe not resolving those problems, but it certainly makes people more educated when they come to the table to try to resolve them.
Yeah, that kind of information, it's essential. I don't know what her response was, but I imagine very enthusiastic of like, that's exactly what's needed. I mean, and to your question at the beginning, right? I mean, people asking like, hey, is my diamond fake or not? I mean, diamonds and gemstones in particular are really challenging in this in this area for local communities, because it's one thing when you're dealing with metals and there's a relatively consistent way of understanding reserves and the price and where the money is going and how the trade works. Diamonds and gemstones don't work that way. I mean, and diamonds are far more formalized, in some ways centralized, than colored gemstones. The bottom line is every stone is different, right? It is very challenging to do a level of geological assessment in the way that you would for, a metal where you can sort of see the way the veins work. Stones, like, they might be there and they might not. And it's really hard for local communities. I mean, it's hard for me, let alone a local community member, who doesn't have a graduate degree, to understand, hey, there's a diamond. You think, oh, diamonds, it's going to be really super valuable in this. And actually it's worth a couple bucks because it's the color's wrong, or it's got the wrong inclusions. And it's really hard to translate that. And the honest answer is that a lot of companies, especially in the diamond business, have ripped local communities off, right? Have used that to their advantage by saying, oh, this isn't really worth very much. And then they go out and it turns out it really is. How's a local community to know, especially the difference between when it's rough? You got to understand not just what does it look like, but like, how is it going to couldn't it be cut in the right way? How many stones, how many finished diamonds are going to come out of this rock? And all that stuff happens in India. Lots of crazy laser technology. And so when there's real data, when, there are companies and organizations that can say, like, we're going to teach you a bit about how to understand what's in the ground, that stuff is so powerful for communities. I've been a part of a few development projects where we've been able to try to convey some of that. And sometimes when developing it, you're sort of sitting around the table in DC or, somewhere in Europe and saying like, gosh, this information is so basic. There's no way they need that level of information. And it turns out it doesn't matter how basic it is. It's still necessary just to take it from a trusted source, to be able to work with it in their own way. It turns out to be really powerful. So
yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about how mining works and the amount of money that it takes to make a mine happen, right? Just to build the mine and then forget about making it profitable, right? And I think the other big challenge with gemstones certainly as well is like, if you invest in infrastructure, you invest in exploration, there's a lot of things that you put money into before you ever start to produce, and that timeline can be really long. And yet oftentimes people don't see that upfront cost, or companies have in the past, messed around with those numbers to the extent where people don't trust them anymore, which is where I'm always a huge fan of having some kind of local community ownership of projects like that. I know that was something we always look at is having things on a percentage basis, as opposed to kind of coming in with a lot of warm, fuzzy projects, right, that make people feel good in the short term, like building schools, building roads. Those are great and they're important, but who in that local community is actually invested for the long term in the project, to where if things are better than expected, they benefit better than expected. If things tank, then they're in it with you, right? It seems like a basic thing, but it does help a lot for people to kind of understand the real business.
No, you're exactly right. And it's still, to me, I mean, it's a bit more episodic for me to know what's happening in different projects, but it does seem like that approach is still less common than it should be, right? That there's a level of cooperation that, it's, another one of the standards, but, there is a model of, free, prior, informed consent of the way companies should work with local communities to understand what's happening and what's going to be developed. And that process, which I think a lot of companies and even frankly governments look at skeptically with respect to local populations, that's really where there's an opportunity to develop just what you're talking about, right? How can we do this together? And the more, because there's plenty of studies that show companies might come in and say, well, we're going to do it on our own and we're going to leave out the local communities. Well, those things tend to result in conflict or, labor strife. And then your mind's shut down. It's going to cost you more in the long run than figuring out how to work cooperatively with the local communities. But those examples are out there. And I think sadly, it's also the case that more of the reporting is about the bad stuff. And there isn't usually as much reporting on, hey, this actually went really well. The company came in, they did what they said they were going to do. The local community benefited. You don't hear that as much. It's not this stuff of reporting and hence more of the mistrust that we talked about before. So
yeah, and I think that's why I'm really looking forward to seeing what the global economy does moving forward when it comes to mining, because just looking at the numbers, the mining industry cannot continue to grow at the rate it needs to grow in terms of bringing new deposits online. And again, not necessarily gemstones specifically, but looking at, the low carbon economy. In order to bring all of that online, the amount of money that will be required to invest in that is way beyond what kind of circulates in our current mining finance little bubble. So you're going to have to be able to attract new money to come into the industry in order to build all those mines. And that really requires us as an industry to talk about and communicate about what we're doing differently. And I always say, it's like, how do we switch a Tesla investor over to becoming a lithium or copper investor? We're investing in companies that mine those minerals and metals. And it's different. You can't use all the jargon. You can't use all the crazy ore body slides that very few people actually understand. I hope that that's a positive shift where it gets a different kind of investor into the space who will hold companies accountable and bring new thoughts and new leadership into where we're going.
Yeah. So often there's still that hesitancy to get involved at the mine level because they're just, it's either bad stories or people that they don't understand the science or how the sector works, but people understand Tesla and they can deal with Elon Musk's, slick advertising and whatever else. But we just did this report at the Century, the back channel, about, Chinese company bribery in Congo and, their mineral sector. And on one hand, you can look at it, on the nefarious, obviously it's a very nefarious story. But one of the important takeaways gets to your point, which is one of the reasons that the Congolese government at the time did that deal was because the Chinese companies were the only ones coming to do those deals, right? Like there was nobody else. And then that led to, one negative problem after another. But it wasn't like the Chinese were competing with multilateral and Western investors who were saying, here's how we can do this properly and responsibly. A lot of those companies are either pulling out or the governments are pulling out, or there's so much pressure not to invest that it just leaves the Chinese or the Russians or whoever else who don't really care and are happy to bring in literally suitcases full of money. You can be sure that in addition to the suitcases full of money, then the mining operations don't translate any more responsibly than the deals were done. And so I think we do need a way to talk about this in a way that encourages Western companies and not just Western, but responsible companies from around the world to engage on these projects, because it can't just be left to the biggest pockets who are willing to do business with anybody and in whatever fashion with no accountability.
Yeah. And I think having been on the government side at first and kind of attended a lot of those interagency meetings and think tank summits and stuff, and still hearing a lot of that content, and also being, working with a small gold mine and dealing with mining companies every day, I think how the industry evaluates risk is actually very different than the rest of the world kind of thinks we do. Legal and regulatory risk is huge, right? Because if you don't think that you're still going to own that mine in the 10 years it takes to build it, you won't go in. Right? Or if you think that your government is going to put that country under sanction and you're 5 years into building that mine, you won't go in. Right? So I oftentimes, when I'm working and traveling in emerging markets, look at how our government supports or doesn't support investment in that area. And I think that's a role that regulators or, our State Department or Commerce Department, tools that can help companies go in and kind of ease in right, in a way that's appropriate for the risk level of that country, to where you can go in and maybe you can invest in a mine that'll take you 10 years to build, but maybe you can go in and partner with a local company that's been vetted, who's already producing at a small scale, right? There's stuff in between that I think our engagement and support at the government level could really help fill that vacuum to where it's not just China that's willing to go to some of these markets.
Yeah. I think because we don't have, the state-owned enterprise model the way that, China or India or Russia do, the approach that you're talking about sounds exactly right to me. And I think, again, doesn't happen, apropos of what I was saying at the beginning, when there were sort of discussions that I would get drawn into when I was at state and thinking, like, how can I be the guy that you're calling on? Like, there have to be people that know this stuff. And we just don't have that kind of interagency task force model in the way that we should, right? We have the USGS guys out in Virginia who, they understand the way the reserves work, but they are usually happy just to sort of keep to themselves and not getting drawn into the mire of policy. And then, how does USAID versus state versus DOD, right? There's all these often competing interests, competing perspectives, and not enough, whether that's an NSC role or somewhere, somebody saying, like, we all need to be around the same table and figuring this out. And I mean, obviously you worked on Afghanistan and there's no more tricky place from all of these different perspectives, right? And so, but no place probably that the US was more invested and from a policy perspective. And it's not clear to me that we did it right there. So if we haven't done it right there, then, like, if we're thinking about DRC or the Central African Republic or Peru, probably we're not doing it right in any of these places. And that's I think an important idea and approach, and whether that's something that comes out of this Summit for Democracy effort around corruption or something else. I think hopefully there's some push that gets different parts of the U.S. government working together in a way that they just haven't so far.
And like working with industry, which always have found to be a really interesting thing, and not to just say it's here in the US, but I think, in many countries, there's kind of a wall that doesn't need to be there between industry and the government. You're a government agency, you can't know how to run a mine and all the difficulties that come with that, right? So talk to the mining companies, right? And ask them, because for the most part, people really want to share and educate. Part of it is mining's not so great history in terms of requiring more regulation, right? And a lot of, the industry maybe has been hesitant to be in, compared to like the oil and gas industry, which I think does a much better job of engagement with the government in terms of communicating value, right? Here's what the industry is bringing to the table. Here's the new technology we've implemented. Here's what we're working on, all that great stuff. I think our industry could go a lot farther than we have in terms of advocating for ourselves and being more open with governments, because we have come a long way in reality. And that doesn't always get communicated. People still think of like dirty miners coming in from a coal mine, right? And like with a pickaxe. And we run mines all over the world, like remotely from control centers now, right? With like really cool autonomous trucks and fun sensors. And we do all this really amazing high-tech stuff that people don't even know about.
Yeah, no, I think there is that common misperception about, mining equals, as you said, like folks coming out of dirty old coal mines. And, you think about a company like Tiffany, which consistently ranks at the high end of every index of responsible business, et cetera. And part of the reason it does that is because it sources gold from a mine in the United States, in Utah, right? I mean, where it knows the conditions, where the mining is done in a way that it's responsible and it has a level of control over. And, there's that side of, even American mining that I think could be, again, not just made clear to the consumer, but become that part of connection to the government in a way that is where there is more alignment and allegiance and willingness to figure out how, they can be helpful. And I think it doesn't need to be corrupt deals under the table, those kinds of things. It's about how do we help and provide the kind of guidance and engagement so that, you have that level of support so that you don't have to worry about the political risk in the same way, or that there's at least a level of communication. And I think you're right that oil and gas in a number of difficult places, you see a lot more. I at least when I was in government, experienced a lot more of, the oil companies coming and saying like, hey, we're doing business in this place. How do we get what we need to get in order to ensure that things continue to flow? And in some cases, probably maybe it shouldn't flow, but they find a way to make it happen. And maybe there is a lesson for the mining sector there too.
Yeah, but I think it's especially for investors who are only now starting to look at investing in mining or minerals, right? Because of a lot of the discussion going on. I think there are things that folks can look at to make sure they're putting their money into the companies that are trying or are doing things the right way. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what are those checklist items that you would recommend people at least research and evaluate before they make an investment or buy a stock.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a little bit of self-interest, but obviously I work for the Responsible Jewelry Council, and we have, most of our members are not mining companies, right? I mean, we have close to 1,600 members now. Most of them are in the middle of the supply chains. But we have, I think, 13 or 14 mining companies who are members, a number of the big ones. So whether it's RJC, there's another initiative called the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, which is a newer standard, much more comprehensive. It only has a few members, but again, provides the sort of cross-the-board kinds of approaches. Otherwise, you're looking at a range of different, mineral by mineral, country by country, issue by issue. What are the risks? So, if you're investing in a company that's engaged in a country where corruption has been an issue, you want to know if they're a part of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which is about revenue transparency. If human rights have been an issue, is the company implementing the voluntary principles on security and human rights? If environmental issues have been a concern, whether it's how are they dealing with mercury or cyanide or any of the chemicals? Are they paying attention to what the IUCN and organizations like that are doing? Even come down to in organizations, just guidance in the mining industry, right? ICMM or organizations like that are more trade associations across the board, just understanding how is the company thinking about all these standards out there and how are they reporting on them. And I think one of the important issues for me, you mentioned ESG at the beginning, and I at the moment, I would say most ESG reporting is frankly not very good because there isn't a level of baseline standards. So it's a lot of, it's advertising more than anything. And it's not honest reporting. And so I think looking not as much at a sort of company's ESG report on its website, but more at, what are the reports they're filing with these different initiatives? What do those look like? And then a lot of it just comes down to due diligence. Like just frankly, Google the company and see, are there NGO reports? Are there media reports? And I'm often surprised that, even in talking to different companies when I was at State, and they would say, well, I'm going into this country and it seems like everything's fine. And I would say, are you kidding? Like, my 5-year-old son could tell you that there are problems by just, for 10 minutes on the internet. Like you have to be willing to look at the hard. And I think the issue is people get worried that if there's something negative, it means that it's all a problem and I'm going to get terrible press and I'm going to get sanctioned and the rest of it. And for the most part, there are a few really bad issues that, yes, if you're involved in, child slavery, yes, that's a huge problem. But a lot of these issues are ones that it's just about how do you work with the local community? How do you work with the local operators? How do you work with local governments? And how do you mitigate these issues over time? And so I think as an investor, it's what is this company reporting to these international initiatives? What kind of staffing do they have? Do they have, a senior executive? Do they have a board member who's responsible for these issues and who's able to make decisions and do they communicate in a way that doesn't just look like, everything's rainbows and unicorns at all their facilities, like that they're actually addressing some of these challenging issues. And so it takes a bit more work for sure than it does to just sort of say like, oh, we're going to invest in this company and they're on this index of great companies. And so I feel fine. You have to look under the hood a little bit, but the information is out there. And the happy thing is there are a lot of standards. There are a lot of initiatives. There's a lot of information out there. In some ways, apropos of that, you're of the app and working with local communities, in some ways there's almost too much information. It's a matter of like, how do you then educate yourself about what's helpful and can lead you to good decisions and you don't have sort of information paralysis kind of thing. Hopefully there's enough momentum that people are willing to take the time and see that there's real gain to be made. And instead of fake mining of things like cryptocurrency, get into real mining of, actual.
Has a much higher carbon footprint, by the way, than actual real mining. Yeah. No, and I always recommend to folks also, no matter what kind of mining or company they're looking at, like the mining industry, I do find to be unique in exploration, especially in that, when you go to that website and you pick up the phone and you call that company and you ask to speak to like the CEO or the head geologist or investor relations, like someone will answer. Mining companies are very investor responsive to answering your questions, and especially the smaller and mid-tier companies, like you can really talk to people at an executive level to better understand what's going on. And, there's a lot, especially over the last 2 years with Zoom, in terms of companies doing webinars and talking about what they're doing in certain places. And I always recommend, especially if it's in an emerging or frontier market or even post-conflict, like look at the board, look at the management team. If you're operating in somewhere in Africa and everybody on the board and in the management team is from the US and Canada, guess what? Probably not a great idea, because the management and leadership of the company doesn't reflect where the company is trying to operate, is another thing I always recommend.
Yeah, no, it's a great point you make about the responsiveness. I mean, when I was at State, and there were a couple of different initiatives like the ones I meant, like voluntary principles, for example, notwithstanding what we said earlier, that sometimes oil and gas is more willing to engage. In those initiatives, it was generally the consensus that, from an NGO and government perspective, we often found the mining companies were more approachable and more willing to sort of deal with harder issues because you're closer to the ground, right? I mean, a lot of oil and gas, maybe it's offshore, or maybe it's the way, or it's really set off from communities, whereas mining is often, in the middle of communities. It's in the middle of issues that you can't really avoid in the way that sometimes you can in oil and gas.
Brad, I've been asking all of my guests recently if you could wave your magic wand and change one thing about the mining industry just magically overnight, what would it be?
If the industry was willing to sort of come to more tables and do more reporting, again, as we've said, there are many good examples of where this is happening, but not enough. And so I think if there was a more across the board adoption of the idea of let's engage honestly about what's happening, let's talk about where the problems are and where we need help, and let's roll up our sleeves and work with government and work with NGOs so that we can get that responsible mining companies are actually able to compete with, companies in the world that are not doing business responsibly and don't care and don't want to do anything other than get what they can out of the ground as cheaply as possible and make the most money. And I think the more we'd see companies willing to say like, hey, this didn't necessarily go well, but we're going to keep at it. And because we're here, as you said, these operations, there's a lot of time that goes and money that goes into getting them up and running. There's a lot that's invested in making them work. So we're here for the long haul. Let's do it responsibly, and let's do it in a way that really works with communities. I think with that level of honest reporting, I think so many other things would flow from that in terms of, greater support for sustainable development, which would be something that would be really, more, as you said earlier, there's a lot of, let's build a school, let's build a road, but really getting into sustainable development and, true skills transfer and those kinds of things, all of that stuff I feel like would flow from just a more level of honest engagement with what's happening on the ground.
I love that. Well, with that, Brad, in honor of your experience and background, I'm going to offer my one piece of gemstone buying advice, which is if it looks too good to be true, you better be sure it is. That's all I ever tell people. But thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to having you on again soon.
Yeah, I would love that. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation, and really appreciate it.
All right. Awesome. Talk to you soon.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you to our guest and my colleague, Brad Brooks-Rubin, for joining us on this episode of On the Rocks. To learn more about Brad and his work, visit him on LinkedIn at responsibljewelry.com and thecentury.org. For more insights on new mining projects, mining news, and more, go to our website at prospectorportal.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Nugget. Thanks for joining us on The Rocks. If you enjoyed the episode, click the subscribe button and please leave a review. Until next time, keep your glasses full and your ice cold. Cheers.